Being patriotic is a pretty common thing to identify with in the United States, and many, if not most Americans, see it as a very positive trait, even when taken to what I see as an unwise extreme. From the childhood rite of passage of reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in school every morning in front of the flag, with the words "under God" and all, to the insistence of nearly every politician that we are without a doubt the most awesome country on earth, we're taught that patriotism, pride in our country, is something important. The American right wing says it the loudest, and usually with some jabs at those amoral socialist Europeans for good measure, but many of the rest of us tend to go along with that thinking to some extent. If politicians don't talk about American exceptionalism loud enough or often enough, you'll see their opponents criticizing them for it. It's as if just thinking it is good enough, and disagreeing may result in an accusation of being un-American, whatever that really means. Whether you're actually doing anything good for the people in your country is very secondary. It's kind of like how works are secondary to belief for many Christians. So even if that is the case, what is a patriot anyway? Well, to a Tea Partier, that may be a churchgoer who owns at least 3 guns and protests at Planned Parenthood clinics to pass the time on the weekends. What is a patriot to me? Well, I don't think you can use political beliefs as a measuring stick for patriotism at all. If that was all it was about, then it becomes a largely subjective measure of how similar someone else's thoughts are to your own. And basics like working or going to school if you're able to, and giving time or money to those less fortunate are a good start to showing pride, because they are fellow humans. If you're fortunate enough to be successful in the system that we have, don't use your wealth to manipulate the system to your benefit at the expense of others. I consider contributions to society at large to be the most important part of pride in your country of residence, and not mere thoughts. If patriotism is all about the level of fervor with which you love your country, or how many fireworks you light on the 4th of July, then that's not a very impressive trait to me. Because then you love your country like a 4-year-old loves mommy. Then we have patriotism's uglier cousin, nationalism. In its most common form, nationalism is the opinion that your country should always look out only for itself, and not give much consideration to how you're affecting those outside your borders. Basically, it's Atlas Shrugged on a global scale. It's not a coincidence that any time a politician is described as ultra-nationalist, it typically means that they love their country so much that they see those in other countries as highly inferior. This is generally fueled by a heavy dose of ethnocentrism, or even worse, racism. Especially in countries with significant social or economic unrest, this kind of thinking can become very attractive to a restless populace. You don't have to go as far back as World War II to see that kind of thinking in action. One of the most fascinating and tragic displays of nationalism took place well within my lifetime in the Balkans. Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic and his cronies gained power through appealing to nationalist feelings bubbling just below the surface, and it erupted in a brutal 3-way war between Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. Ever wonder when the term ethnic cleansing entered the popular lexicon? Now you know. There's a fascinating documentary on the brutal conflict called The Death of Yugoslavia that I highly recommend. In some of the earlier footage, you can almost look into Slobodan Milosevic's eyes and see the exact moment that he realized what his path to power would be. If you watch it, pay attention to where he tells a Serb crowd that the Kosovan police will not treat them like that again, despite local Serbs intentionally setting up a conflict with them. He learned to use that same principle in more and more bloody ways, putting a nationalist mob above the interests of civilized society in his quest for power, along with his military henchmen. NATO bombings ended his reign of terror and civilian slaughter years later, but many Serbs still hail these butchers as heroes, and some of them will find this video and defend him to this day. That's because there's always a market for a politician to arrive and make you feel better by telling you that the reason your life isn't as good as you had hoped is because someone else is actively undermining it, and late 80s Yugoslavia was especially ripe for that kind of nationalist. The leaders of all 3 factions were responsible for civilian massacres. My personal feelings on the subject of patriotism and nationalism are that I admire my country in some ways, but any patriotism that I have is very conditional. Living in the United States is like playing a very complex video game on a very high difficulty level. It can be a very rewarding experience if you play it right and get a little luck, but it's complicated to navigate successfully, and it's set up to be brutally unfair, with many circumstances beyond your control, able to cripple you physically or financially, and really that's the case with most countries. I could never be a nationalist, because just as I think my fellow Americans should have better opportunities, so should the rest of the world. And while some conflict is inevitable, most of the time we don't have to sacrifice one for another. If someone tells you otherwise, you should always ask them how they will personally benefit. Because if you truly think humanity should be the highest priority, then putting your country above it is no better than putting God above it.